Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanre Akinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. This week on The Business, Israel suspends a deal with the UN to resettle African migrants under growing right-wing pressure. Rwanda squares off with Washington over its textile industry as Donald Trump's trade war hots up. And South African mining companies win an important court battle on black ownership laws. And this week's big story, as Ethiopia's new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed takes office, we ask what changes he might bring to Africa's fastest growing economy. And the breakdown, we thought it was declining, but is piracy on Africa's coast rising again? Joining me throughout for insight and analysis is business reporter Thomas Collins. And in part two, I'll be talking to Vena Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. We start in Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this week abandoned a deal with the UN to resettle African migrants who've entered the country illegally 24 hours after that deal was agreed. The bigger picture is that this is around a contentious plan to forcibly deport close to 40,000 migrants from the country, which has caused a lot of criticism both in Israel and elsewhere. Tom, just another reminder of Africa's migration challenge. What's going on here? Why is Israel trying to get rid of all these African migrants?
Well, that's exactly it. This forms part of Africa's bigger migration crisis, and he originally tried to force them back into allegedly Rwanda and Uganda, but obviously had opposition within his own party and within humanitarian organizations to try and find another deal. He then went back on that deal, which I think was due to the international pressure, and now it really remains to be seen what he will actually do.
There hasn't been much of a response from African governments. They've been very quiet on this.
No, the Israeli government is in Africa with kind of arms and solar energy. They're very important, an economic partner. So I think in terms of public governance, they've been very quiet just to kind of maintain the relations and
they don't want to jeopardize that relationship. Thank you very much, Tom. Africa's migration challenge continues. Now the world is bracing itself for a possible trade war between the US and China. But there's a much smaller trade standoff going on in East Africa, which is quite interesting. Rwanda has lost its privileges of duty-free access to the US market for textiles under something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. This is because they've slapped restrictions on the importing of second-hand clothes, which they say undermines local industry. Tom, interesting one this. It seems that Donald Trump's protectionism isn't just about China. Africa is feeling it as well. Yes, it may be a nasty surprise for Washington, and I think Kagame's been very strong and raised the tariffs from $0.2 per kilogram to 2.5. They're trying to boost their local manufacturing industry, and I think this is the right way to go. And they're not the only ones. So this was originally a plan that also included Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, I believe. But those three have all backed off. So Rwanda is the only one that's sort of willing to stand up to Donald Trump, as it were. And I mean, as we all know, that's classic Kagame, and I think he's kind of building it into a greater dialogue between the US and China, in which the US had made an inquiry around Chinese involvement on the continent. And recently, three presidents, Hage Gamba from Namibia and Mnangagwa from Zimbabwe, went to China to reaffirm those relations. And Kagame's seen this kind of opportunity and has used it as a good PR to stand up to Washington. Potentially a good example for others to follow? Yeah, I think so, yeah. I think we won't know what will happen just yet. Washington has said that they're going to have to not be suspended from the actual AGOA, but they've just been... just the rights have been suspended. That's it, yeah. So it's unclear which side will back down first, but I mean, it's certainly interesting to watch. All right, thank you very much, Tom. Well, the protectionism battle continues. South Africa's mining industry scored a big legal victory this week when a court ruled in their favor about proposals to increase black ownership from 26 to 30% in the country. The issue has had the government at odds with the industry for more than a year, and it stifled much needed investment. Tom, sounds like this is good news for the mining sector. Is it also good news for the government?
Well, the miners wanted certainty, and that's exactly what they got. 26% of black ownership in their companies is what they wanted to find out and know and project on that basis. On the other hand, the government is pushing back against miners and trying to reconfigure the relationship, rejig the relationship, which is also happening on a larger scale within Africa at the moment.
Now, the government isn't just doing this randomly. Now, 26% doesn't sound like a lot to me. And South Africa, just this week, by the World Bank, was officially declared the world's most unequal society. So there's clearly a need to rebalance things here. I mean, these miners aren't going out of business. They're making billions in profits. So what's the issue? Why is it such a problem for them?
Most definitely, yeah. In the new administration, he's kind of he's kind of really walking a tightrope between the miners and the industry, and also the locals and the black South Africans. So this is his choice at the moment, is to back the miners. But I think in the future, I mean, it remains to be seen what will happen.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's part of the tightrope that President Cyril Ramaphosa has to walk. For our big story this week, we go to Ethiopia, where Abiy Ahmed has been sworn in as the country's new prime minister. He takes over from Haile Mariam Desalegn, who surprisingly resigned in February amid popular unrest and growing opposition to the minority-controlled government. Ahmed has pledged reform and to drive national unity in what many are seeing as an important milestone for Ethiopia. Tom, everything about this says this is an important moment for the country. How big of a deal is this?
I think it's huge. The previous administration were Tigray dominated, which is surprisingly the smallest minority in Ethiopia, yet they have the biggest power. So to bring in Ahmed from an Oromia region,
who are the biggest
group, exactly, that is hugely symbolic and indicative of an idea to appease the masses who have been really protesting marginalization for a long time.
Now, an immediate priority for Ahmed clearly is to address some of the social tensions and political tensions we've seen over the last few years, which have resulted in mass protests and hundreds of deaths. But at the back of his mind, he must be thinking about the economic dimension. Ethiopia is growing very quickly. It's trying to establish itself as a manufacturing hub for the region. Could this be a catalyst to see even more development and growth?
Definitely. I think they grew the largest amount last year of any country in the world, and if they can really turn that wealth and share it within the masses, then they will be able to look forward beyond politics to a more economically, more kind of grounded society.
Now, there's no disputing the symbolic power of this, having someone like Ahmed, but he's a relatively unknown entity. Is this just symbolism? Is this the ruling coalition just kind of trying to appease the masses, or is this indicative of meaningful change?
I think it remains to be seen. What we have to remember is that he is an EPRDF man, which is the ruling party. He's 41. He used to be the Minister of Science and Technology, but he does come from within the party, even though he's from the Oromia region. So what line he will walk in the future, we can only guess.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. Either way, Ethiopia is a country to watch closely. For our breakdown this week, we look at piracy in Africa. At its peak at around 2010, it was making regular global headlines and even inspired a big Hollywood movie with Tom Hanks. Now, it's been on the decline in recent years, but it's flared up again over the last 12 months. And this year alone in West Africa, there have been 50 reported incidents of piracy. Tom, we thought the pirates of the Gulf of Guinea and the Gulf of Aden had left, but it seems they're back. What's going on here?
Well, what's happening is there's been a kind of downturn in international effort. As we thought they were gone, and especially in the Gulf of Aden outside Somalia, international forces like NATO have withdrawn, and that's led to these pirates coming back.
And shipping companies as well, they've sort of been flouting rules because there was a very strong international response, and that seemed to pretty much clear things up. How about West Africa? Bit of a different story there, because there it seems to really be getting worse. 50 incidents in 2018 alone. South Korea has just dispatched a warship to the Gulf of Guinea. What's happening there?
Well, the Gulf of Guinea has been gradually rising as the poster boy of the new African piracy. I think what's happening is that it's kind of related to the government. So Somalia and Nigeria have very poor governance, not providing much for their citizens. And in these cases, when they're bordering the coastline, you'll see people taking to the sea to provide an income.
Well, that's an interesting point, because the problem is on sea, but the root of the problem and arguably the solution is on land.
That's it, and it's reminiscent of the migrant crisis in Libya. If you can't provide for the citizens at home, then they will find alternative solutions. So I think what we need to do is get more development into Somalia and Nigeria and really make sure that they can offer something to their people.
Who needs to step up here? Obviously, the governments need to do something. The international community, do they need to do something here? Are shipping companies themselves responsible for this? How do we fix this?
I think it's a two-pronged approach. Firstly, international actors like NATO, the UN, even bilaterally, unilaterally, they need to step up their efforts, and also the governments themselves. They need to make sure they can really provide security in these areas.
Tom, thank you very much for all the commentary and insight today. Interesting times ahead for piracy in Africa. We'll take a quick break now. Join me in part 2 of the business when I'll be talking to Vena Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. Welcome back to the business, where I'm delighted to be joined by Vena Ayukegba, Principal Africa Analyst at IHS Markit. Vena, thank you very much for joining me today. Risk and Africa, they seem to go hand in hand. Whenever we talk about investing in Africa, doing business in Africa, one of the first questions is, what about the risk? The political risk, the social risk, the economic risk. Is the risk perception of Africa justified?
Well, it's one of those questions where you always have to start with, it depends. Because it certainly depends on what you're out for, what you're looking for. There are a lot of cases where we have seen that the risk is not justified in terms of the premiums which insurance companies, for example, or other capital investors are seeking with respect to investing in Africa. There are other cases where you can't deny that there is conflict and there is war in certain places, where certainly that is, the highest possible risk you can actually think about. But I would always urge investors to look at the specific opportunity which they're looking at and to do the work in terms of the due diligence before deciding on general risk parameters which are being thrown around on a daily basis and unfortunately put Africa on the map, on a high-risk map in that sense.
It has moved on a little bit because even if you think back to 10 years ago, the kind of thing that we saw in Kenya last year around the disputed elections would have scared people off in droves. Yeah. Yet this time, it didn't really seem to have much of an impact on investor sentiment and on the economy. People just kind of got on with things. Is that a reflection that the message is starting to trickle through?
It is, and I think the Kenyan situation, as unfortunate as it looked like, on the first view, was actually a good thing because it showed process. It showed the courts taking a stand, and it showed parties actually respecting the verdict of the court and letting a process run through. So in terms of the risk perspective, the risk connotation of Kenya with that particular election, I do think Kenya actually turned out really well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, it depends on how you look at it, but there are things that you have to factor in if you're looking at the continent, if you're thinking of doing an investment anywhere. Looking at 2018, what would you say are some of the key issues that you need to have in mind? Some of the big macro trends across Africa. I'm thinking around things like conflict, especially in hotspots like the Sahel. We've seen a lot of activity around that. Thinking of things like migration, elections and politics. There's always volatility around these things. If you had to pick 2 or 3, what would be your key messages in terms of this is what you should look out for?
Yes. Well, the one thing which I would always have to pick, particularly if we're talking from an economic perspective, is the price of natural resources in that sense. And if you look at the price of oil, which has been trending upwards in recent months, in that sense, that's a significantly good indicator for a lot of these economies which you have actually named that are resource heavy in terms of the way they generate revenue. If you look, of course, at conflict in the Sahel, that's a problem. That's a problem which is likely to continue. That's a problem which is generally also fueled by poor governance and the absence of the state.
Is this something you should be worried about if you're looking to do an investment?
It's something to certainly be worried about if you're doing an investment in the north of Niger. In that sense, if you were running a mine in the north of Niger, if you are running a mine, for example, a gold mine in Mali, those are certainly things you should be worried about. In that, but then that is not all of the whole country. So if you come south of Niger, there's exploration, petroleum exploration going on, largely untouched, at least at the moment, with respect to where it is based. So you always have to be wary about specifically where you have militancy problems, rather than painting a whole country or a whole region in that sense.
The point is nuance. And on that, let's look at some specific countries.
Yes.
They are the usual suspects that you've got to look at. Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya. These are the big economies. Yeah. All of these economies in their own way are in interesting times, shall we say, at the moment. Let's just run through them.
General Fattah al-Sisi has actually strengthened his power in recent times. We don't see any major...
And he has no opponents. Everyone has dropped out.
No, we don't see that. But then one key thing here is to see that Egypt seems to have actually been improving economically in that sense in what they're doing. We were expecting potentially protests in that sense, which we aren't seeing. We have seen the FX situation in terms of the reserves, which they have strengthened. The programs which they're running with the IMF and other international donors look to be positive after a second review in that sense. And so positively, and the last thing for Egypt also, major gas reserves are actually coming online in 2018. And so there's a lot of...
The Zohr gas fields.
Exactly.
One of the biggest ever discovered.
Yes, and so there's a lot of positive news in that sense, which is coming at least from a business perspective out of Egypt for 2018.
So al-Sisi, he does enjoy legitimacy, which is perhaps not that obvious from the outside, but internally.
I mean, it always depends from which angle when you're looking at legitimacy in that sense. But from where we stand, there's only one president in Egypt at the moment, and he seems to be accepted by the population, at least. All right.
We have to run through these a little bit. Yes. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but very quickly on South Africa.
There is an agreement, or is generally agreed in South Africa, that, or at least within the ANC, prior to elections in 2019. I suspect Ramaphosa wants it for him to be able to have time to put his mark before an elections for the ANC and to increase ANC's chances in the elections without a tainted Zuma in that sense, with all the corruption probes that you have.
The key question is also, is Ramaphosa going to be able to use this time to restore confidence in the economy? Do you see that happening?
We do think having Ramaphosa in as head of the ANC has already done a lot to boost confidence in that sense. If you look at the South African stock market, it has gained tremendously and the currency has strengthened vis-a-vis the dollar in the past month. In that sense, that is already a significant sign of confidence. When we look at what Ramaphosa has said in respect to what he's looking to do from an economic perspective, you have, I think investors are greeting that positively. It is now to see how he's able to implement all of that during the 2018 period.
It's going to be another eventful year, no matter what happens. Let's talk about the really big one, Nigeria. Elections next year, the campaigning is already in full swing. Coming out of a difficult period for its economy, oil prices are rebounding. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. What can we expect economically from Nigeria in 2018?
Now, it's always a difficult one to make predictions about Nigeria whenever we are in front of elections in that sense. As you have already said, the electioneering has already started, and it makes it difficult for Nigerian policymakers to be able to push through a policy or decide on policy without thinking about the electoral consequences of that. And so what we're likely to see, unfortunately, in Nigeria is a lot of short-termism as we move towards both major parties coalescing around a particular candidate. In the case of the APC, the governing party, we do think President Muhammadu Buhari is likely to stand again, particularly as we saw Atiku Abubakar, who's a strong candidate, potential candidate also within the APC decamp to the PDP, that is a key sign that the president is likely to stand.
Uncertain, difficult to predict. We've touched on Kenya. We don't have much time left. We've touched on Kenya. Briefly, outlook positive or negative for Kenya 2018?
Kenya, that's a difficult one. That's certainly going to depend on the price. Kenya is a net importer of oil products, and so of course inflationary pressures likely to rise. If at all, Kenya has to import oil much more expensively in that sense, which feeds into a lot of other products within the country. There is still a lot to be able to done from an infrastructural perspective. Debt to GDP is rising fast. So there are some negative blinkers showing up for Kenya in that sense, unfortunately.
Now, very quick fire question, this one. We are almost out of time. Your top line, we've talked about the usual suspects. What are some other key markets to look at and why? No more than a few seconds on each.
Well, two I'm going to pick up is the first one is going to be Angola. We just had a change in president in Angola. There's a push going through the system in that sense. We're seeing major players being taken out of their positions, and the president is looking to diversify the economy away from oil. We're seeing a lot of movement also within the oil sector and the banking sector in that sense to change the way things are. And so positive signs there if the country is able to keep some of those reforms in that sense. A second one, which is generally not on many people's list, is Mozambique.
Very, very, very quickly.
It's Mozambique, and of course, that is where the gas is. Huge gas deposits in that sense. And so, of course, we do think 2018, we're going to see a lot of activity around exploring that.
Some of the biggest untapped gas reserves in the world.
Yes.
So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. Werner, thank you very much, as always. Lots to talk about, lots more to talk about, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much for the insight.
Thank you for having me.
From all of us here at The Business, thank you for watching. Please join us again next time.